Well, I'm here to talk about how everything that you know about web design has just changed. If you're interested, these slides are right now up at notice.com/Jen Simmons, or apparently a robot just tweeted the link for me in my Twitter account. And what I mean by that is that everything you know about layout and graphic design has just changed. Not user experience design, not all kinds of things about business, the business of getting your project right for your customers. But the things about layout and about graphic design that Hoi-Jin was just talking about and that Mandy was talking about, it's a new era in CSS and the superpowers of what we can do with CSS. But I think for many of us, especially if you've been having a professional career for the last 5 years or you're aspiring to have a professional career, you may have the impression that the way we've been doing layout recently is the way that it's always been done, that this is just, you're just doing it the way it's supposed to be, right? Or maybe you do have a sense that, well, a bunch of people at work have been fighting about this responsive or not responsive thing. So I guess there was a thing we used to do, and then we switched to responsive web design. Responsive web design is the way to do it. That's correct. Now we've solved this problem. But the truth is that if you've been around long enough, you will remember a bunch of different ideas that we had about how to accomplish layout on the web and all the struggles that we've gone through. And I think the reason, really, we've been struggling is because there's been this tug of war between two sides, and one is wanting one thing and one's wanting the other, and we can't really agree, and we're just someone sitting in the sandbox crying, saying, we need more art, we need real graphic design, it should be beautiful, look at the magazines, look at the filmmaking, look at the sculpture, why don't we have more artistic merit on the web? And then on the other hand, we've had these folks grabbing, saying, no, but that's not how the web works. You need to have beautiful code. You need to lean into the medium. You need to stay within the constraints of the medium. No, don't send that to me in a PDF. I can't make that. Why don't you understand how the web works? So we've had these attempts over the years. We've tried over and over again to solve page layout on the web. We started with simple HTML. That's how it all started back in the day. This is what we had. Simple layouts. I have there, you can see a headline. There's an invisible box around that headline. Any of the browser engineers in the room, people who make a browser for a living, know this, that everything is a box, whether it looks like it is or not. And you can, I'm going to add a paragraph, and you can then see how those two boxes are reflowing. When the browser's narrower, when the viewport's narrower, the text reflows and it gets taller. Things kind of automatically grow and shrink in order to fit the content that's there. And the image, you drop the image in. Images back in the day were the size that you made them in Photoshop or Fireworks or wherever you were making images. It's just sitting there on the page at its intrinsic size. We've got overflow, right? I think layout is the history of struggling with overflow. But this is flow layout, this idea that things will, if there's another paragraph that gets inserted, if somebody comes along and changes the content and they erase a paragraph, that things will get taller or shorter and just readjust and rejiggle themselves. They don't start to overlap, they rejiggle. This is a concept called flow layout. We've never really called it that because we never really needed a name for it. But now that I think that it's almost like we've been fish swimming around in water and we didn't know it was called water, and now we're growing legs and getting out on land. And as we talk about things like CSS Grid and we define what land is, we also need to define what water is. Flow layout, it let you do these kinds of layouts. And so websites look like this. We could center images, we could put things next to each other, we could center text, we could change the color of the background if we stayed within the 216 colors that were available. We also had tables. Now, tables in HTML are really awesome when you have tabular data. If you have tabular data, please use a table. Please use a table. Do not get confused by the fact that lots of people say do not use tables for layout. What happened is a lot of designers wanted to do something interesting with their layouts. There were no other tools, and they realized, oh gosh, if I put some text in that table cell, I put some images in those table cells and make the lines go away, I can start to create a layout. And the era of tables for layout was born. And this era went along. How many people here did a table-based layout, right? Many of you. The good thing about this era is that we had some amazing, beautiful graphic design. It was the 90s. We rocked our pixels. We did all kinds of crazy stuff. We brought in ideas from hypertext and the CD-ROM era, and we sort of got creative about what was possible. For those of you who weren't there, what we were doing anytime we had some sort of an image, lots of times, like here on this example, there's 2 paragraphs of text, and we have one of them over on the left and one of them over on the right. And so to get that card layout, you'd go into a program like Fireworks or others, and you'd chop your images up into lots of different puzzle pieces, and you'd very carefully piece them back together again in Dreamweaver and pray. Here, the table borders are turned back on so you can see the lines and you can see the separation between the puzzle pieces. But of course, you would make your table borders be 0, and then all of that stuff would disappear. This became the process. Go into Photoshop and draw what you want everything to look like. Code it by any means necessary. It doesn't matter how evil your code is. And on the other side, on the other end, you hopefully get out a good website, the website that you wanted. Sometimes I almost feel like we're back to this era of by any means necessary. It's okay if the code looks like crap when I look at, like, I don't know, React with CSS inline styles and stuff, but we won't talk about that. One of the big problems of this era is that there was a drastic lack of interoperability between web browsers. So the people at Netscape kind of did what they wanted, and the people at IE kind of did what they wanted, and those 2 browsers did not do the same thing with the same code. And so we ended up stuck in this world where you had to basically make 2 websites with different code, and then, or if you didn't have the budget for it, then you just put a banner on your website that said, this site only works in Netscape 3. Too bad for you. So we tried again. That was tricky, hard, annoying, too many puzzle pieces, so we tried again with Flash. And this was a big, I mean, how many of you made Flash websites? All Flash. Not just Flash for ads or Flash for videos, but like the entire website was in Flash. This is how it worked. It had a completely different mental model. It was much more like going into something like Sketch, or going into, well, Macromedia Director, or even almost more like Final Cut Pro or something, and laying out your content. One of the very first question you had to answer when the program opened up and you were making a new movie was, how big do you want your movie stage to be? And you defined that in pixels. And then you had this timeline, and everything was laid out on this timeline. For layout, the mental model of Flash was the mental model of the GUI, of the computer that had a mouse, where something like a box was on the page at a certain number of pixels from the top, a certain number of pixels from the left. The box was a certain number of pixels in each dimension. That's how the computer thought about that layout. Or it also is the same kind of mental model of the real world. If you are doing paste up and you want to center some text, it's your job to make sure that it's centered with your ruler and straight with your drafting table. And if you accomplish that, then hey, you've accomplished that. Everything in Flash, every bit of text, every box, every headline, every paragraph was a separate object, and you handled those objects. And as a developer, you were responsible for making sure that you programmed in where all of those objects were going to be at any given time in this fixed size box. If you wanted scroll bars, you had to make your own scroll bars, which is a terrible idea. Do not make your own scroll bars. It also meant that this box was just kind of stuck on the web page. The web page, the HTML, just became sort of a container for holding up blocks of mystery. And the web page, the web technology, the browser didn't have any idea what was inside of the box of mystery, which meant neither did any sort of search engine robot or any kind of accessibility device. This was terrible. None of these sites would show up on Google. None of these sites were accessible. It also meant that if you were a person editing content, it was very hard to edit the content because you had to go back into the movie and change all of the text and all of the objects and change the layout in order to make a new blog post. So we stopped doing that. But also the browser window, when the viewport got bigger, there was no way for the viewport to rejiggle the layout. The layout wasn't actually part of the web. So we tried again, and we said, okay, we got to go back to it's the web. We can't just have any art by any means necessary. We need to respect the medium. Let's figure out how to do this properly. And along came CSS, especially once it was usable in real browsers. Here's a page from Jeffrey Zeldman's Designing with Web Standards from 2003, where he very clearly articulates, look, this crappy code is not a good idea. It's really painful. Look at what you can do instead. In your HTML, just write semantic tags around your content. It's easy. It's not easy, but it's elegant. There's like a purity to this way of coding. Images, rather than taking your picture of a dog and chopping it up into 4 pieces and reassembling it in a table, you would just have a picture of a dog. I remember how elegant that really felt as someone building websites, that it wasn't nearly as complicated, that there was something about the purity of the code and the way that it represented the actual content that just made life so much easier. One of the lessons from this era that we carry with us to today and that we still need to value today is the advantages of using semantic markup and what we get from using semantic markup. And also the principle of the separation of concerns, where HTML is about the content and representing the content. It's about creating the interface with forms and buttons using real button elements and real form fields, that's good. And when the CSS falls off because someone's using reader mode or someone has saved it in some sort of like Instapaper or Pocket or some kind of program, that it's fine. They can read the content. They can do what they're supposed to do. And then CSS will handle the visual look and the layout, fingers crossed, comes eventually. And JavaScript, of course, came along later for behavior, for fancier kind of lazy logging, for fancier sort of interfaces and form elements. But this idea of separating the concerns and having a stack of technology being a better solution is something that stays with us today. So how are we going to do layout in CSS? The original plan was to use absolute positioning. And absolute positioning has the same mental model as the GUI. You would take something, an element, and absolutely position it and measure how much from the top and how much from the left you're going to have it be. You're going to tell everybody how big it's going to be, and that's what you get. The problem with absolute positioning, though, and there's nothing wrong with using it. There are plenty of use cases today that we use it for, usually for little things like a little new banner, where the word new is always the word new. You know how big it is. It's easy to handle. But if you're trying to absolutely position a paragraph, and then you want to absolutely position another paragraph underneath, but you have no idea how tall or wide, absolutely positioning things gets rid of the flow, and you get rid of the advantage of the flow. So it turns out it's a terrible way to do layout of the whole entire page, to try to position everything, every box on the page. Then the developer is responsible to position every box on the page. Bert Boss and Hakam Lee, two of the people who wrote the CSS1 specification, they spoke at CSS Day in 2017, and someone from the audience asked them, is there anything that you think you shouldn't have done, that you shouldn't have put into CSS at all? And Hakam Lee, the father of CSS, said, very sheepishly, maybe absolute positioning. So here it is on the timeline, poor little AppsPause trying to be our layout system, but it just didn't work. So what did we do? We figured out some hacks, and we started using floats and doing fluid layouts. So floats are awesome. Floats were designed to do this. You take an image, you float it to the left, you let the rest of the content flow around the floated object. That's cool. We should do that today. Throw a little shape on there, shape outside, and you can flow it in a shape that's not a square or a rectangle. That's cool. But this is what we did in the beginning of layout, where we would take, say, the first 2 elements and wrap them in some sort of wrapper like a div, and take the rest of the content and wrap it in another div. We'll float that first wrapper to the left. We'll float the second wrapper to the right. We'll give both of them maybe a width of 45%, because God forbid you get anywhere near 100% total. And just leave this gap in the middle and pray. But you saw just a moment ago there was an image. The image was its fixed size. This is back in the beginning of floated-based layouts, fluid layouts. We had these problems with overflow and whatever, but we just tried our best. Here's another. But there's the concept that comes from this era that we still carry with us today, that we've still been using quite a lot up until the last few years, is this idea of having fluid columns. That there's something cool about having fluid columns, and we want that. Here's another example of more of a blog layout that we had quite a bit. And lots of people love fluid layout because it felt like it was of the web and it was a good idea, it was of the medium. But a lot of other people didn't because you had this kind of awkward space on the right and the line length of the text would get far too long and typographers were like, no. And here, in order to make sure the image never overflows the sidebar, I need to make the image even smaller and just pretend that everybody's monitor is at least 800 pixels wide. And then you have an even bigger, awkward white space. I was never really a fan, personally, of fluid web design because I didn't like these things. But this was a major movement in the history of layout, in our attempts to do layout. We get back, however, to this battle of some people saying it's the web, fluid is best, and some people saying, but we need art. Ugly is ugly. So we get to this place of fixed with layouts using floats, right? Where we say, I'm going to fix those boxes. I'm not going to let them be fluid. That way I never have awkward, weird space next to my image. That way I can make the line length of the text be whatever I want it to be. And instead what we end up with is the whole layout of all that content is kind of fixed within itself and all of it overflows. So when the page is bigger than the size we thought it was going to be, you just kind of have giant amounts of overflow. But it didn't look broken, and that's what was important, especially to say, like, bosses and people at advertising agencies. In this era, the era of fixed width floats, there was chaos. I remember working on a team of about 100 people in a financial institution in Lower Manhattan, and everybody kept sending PDFs that were like 8 or 3 or 9 pixels off of other people's PDFs and insisting that everything be pixel perfect to their PDF. And it's like every page is a different. So 960 grid was a way to say, hey, memo, everyone must use the 960 grid PDF template. Here's your OmniGraffle file. Here's your Visio file. Please, let's have a standard. Like the idea of having a design standard, of standardizing a team on a certain system is a good idea. That's something that a lot of folks are talking about today. How do we have a design system? How do we make it custom for our own brand? But kind of what ended up happening is 960 and the things that came before it and the things that came after it standardized in the industry this idea that you should always use 12 columns, that every column should be 60 pixels wide, every gutter should be 20 pixels wide. Like 9 is easily divisible by 2, 6, 3, and 4, so therefore it's best. God has ordained us to use the 12 column layout. And we ended up with this kind of world where we see a lot of the same things over and over again. User experience design became draw wireframes that look like this. But in those days, we did discover, and we've since forced ourselves to forget, but I think we should remember when it's a good idea to have fixed size content. Sometimes it actually works out really well to have something, an image or something that's just a fixed size. Maybe even the ads that come from the IEB regs and are going to be fixed no matter what you do. We have fixed size content in our world. We've been trying to pretend, but. So here we go, fixed, another era on the timeline. And we probably all know what comes next after fixed responsive web design. Ethan Marcotte in 2010 coined this term, responsive web design, and he defined it as a flexible grid, to go back to flexible columns, flexible images, and media queries. You combine those 3 things together and you end up with responsive web design. And that's the era that we've been in for a while. It's actually sort of the longest box on this timeline. We've kind of been in the responsive era longer than we've been in any of those previous eras. So, you know, maybe it won't last forever. Here is what that example looks like in a responsive design, where the image has a width of 100% set on it, so that it always is 100% of its containing block. That way, when the container gets smaller, it gets smaller. When the container gets bigger, it gets bigger. And then that sidebar, of course, we can add a breakpoint, a media query, to say, hey, when things are like at below this number, I happen to know that they're going to get weird, me, the human, so I'm going to say, don't lay out like that. Switch it and put it down underneath. Fluid images and media queries. These are the 2 big ideas that landed in the industry in the era of responsive web design that have stuck with us, that are still really good ideas, even as we change our techniques and we don't use floats and we don't use percents. Having fluid images, having fluid things like video, using media queries when necessary are things that in our toolbox. Unfortunately, I think it's unfortunately, that kind of wireframe, folks were very, I think, overwhelmed about knowing what responsive layouts would look like. And so therefore we kind of entered the 8 years of this, right? We got 12 columns, 8 columns, 4 columns, or maybe 2 columns, and that's awesome. We got the desktop layout, the tablet layout, the mobile layout. I'm done. I emailed you the PDF. I'm done. I don't want to talk to you. And our designs kind of all end up looking like this. How many people have built this website? Right? How many people are sick of looking at this website? It looked really beautiful when it was new. That was a long time ago. We don't have to stay stuck in that layout because we have now all of this CSS. All of these things really weren't a thing when responsive web design started. There's a whole bunch of properties. I'm only going to be able to have time to talk about a few, but others today have talked about others, and there's plenty out there about them. These are awesome. This is the new toolkit that we have. And we're going to be using these tools along with all of this CSS that we've had for a long time. And we're going to keep using floats to do floats. We're going to keep using margins, maybe occasionally even a negative margin. We are going to combine all of these things to create amazing layouts. The 4 major things that we're going to use are flow layout, CSS grid, multi-column, and flexbox. And flow, today, I'm sort of always talking about the horizontal TB writing mode, which is how English works. It goes left to right along a horizontal line. But as Huijing was just talking about, you can also change the writing mode so that your text flows along a vertical line, or your text can flow from right to left. Just to keep your brains from completely exploding, I'm staying in the horizontal TB left to right writing mode. But writing modes are important, and they can be used, as she showed you, for all kinds of text effects that are really kind of awesome. But here's an example of how these 4 things are going to be combined. I and Rachel Andrew and others were constantly getting this question of, which one should I use now, Flexbox or Grid? Did Grid replace Flexbox? Flexbox must be terrible. Now we have Grid. I get it because people are thinking, like, should I use Bootstrap or Foundation? Which one's better? I'm not going to use both. I used to use Foundation. Now I'm going to use Bootstrap, or vice versa. But Flexbox and Grid are not 2 separate frameworks. They're 2 pieces of CSS. CSS, the native framework, if you will, of web layout. And you're going to use both of them. They do different things, and they both are awesome, and you should use them for different things. So here's an example. Like, maybe we have this card. We have a teaser card with some content on it, and we decide we're going to lay out the internal structure of that teaser card using Flexbox, perhaps because we have a lot of variations of that card, and we want to have Flexbox use the ability of Flexbox to do some interesting layouts, so we have one little bit of CSS that just kind of handles a whole bunch of different layouts depending on which kind of content is in that particular instance of the teaser. But then we'll lay out the whole set of teasers using CSS Grid, because that's the kind of thing that Grid really likes to do. Then maybe we have a sort of sidebar-ish stuff over there on the side, but we just have this image. We don't really need to do much with it. But underneath the image, we've got like a whole bunch of little things, and maybe multi-column is the perfect tool for laying that out in a way that's going to make sense. And then we're going to take those 2 things, the image and the multi-column things, and we need to lay them out together, but we don't actually have to do anything, because they're just going to hang out together inside their containing block with a flow layout. And flow is the default. If you do nothing else, you get flow. So there they are in a little flow layout. But maybe that sidebar thing and the bigger teaser card layout, we need to lay those 2 things out together. So we'll make the containing box of those 2 things have display grid on it and create a grid layout, a grid formatting context for that container. It's a bunch of nested containers. Then we've got some navigation up on the top. You know what? Navigation and Flexbox are in love with each other. They go along really well. We're just going to go with that. And then the whole outer container of the page, we're just going to have flow layout. There's not really anything else that we need to do. So that's how these things work together. And as you learn what each one of them does, whether you're a front-end developer who's writing CSS and writing code, or whether you're not. Maybe you're a person who's literally never going to write a line of code in your life. You're a designer, and you want to be able to understand how to ask for what you want, and someone else can write the code. Or you're some kind of stakeholder, you're a client, you're a content person, and you're in meetings where you want to have some say in what happens in the design too. You can start to learn that, oh, there's different tools, and they have different sorts of ways in which they work. Maybe you don't always remember which is which, but you know to start to ask for the kinds of things you want because you understand that these are the things that are possible. So today I'm going to talk about CSS Grid especially. CSS Grid is the superpower that we have. It's the most exciting thing. It's kind of the thing that makes the huge change happen the most. And as I was learning CSS Grid 2 years ago, and I was making example after example, my first thought was, it's responsive web design now more better. I'm doing responsive layouts, I'm doing responsive web design. It's just far easier to write this code. This code is elegant, it's not awful, it's easy, it's not this crappy float-based stuff. But the deeper and deeper I got, and the more I understood what Grid actually wants to do, I realized, oh, we're in a new era of layout. This is not responsive web design now more better. This is actually something different. And I believe that in a large part because the dynamic of this fight has changed, where instead of us being in the it's the web era of responsive web design, which is what we've been doing for the last 8 years, or the, oh, we need art, but our code is going to be crap, this dynamic has actually totally changed with the tools that we have today. So I think it's helpful to have a name. I think it's helpful for these eras to be named. You can go into meetings and say, we're not doing tables for layout anymore. We're going to do float-based layout. Oh, we're not doing fixed width layout anymore. We're doing responsive web design, and those things mean something. So over the winter, I was really trying to figure out, like, what could be a good name. And I'm proposing that we call this new era intrinsic web design. And intrinsic meaning it's belonging to or the essential nature or constitution of a thing. It's intrinsic to the web. It's also the name of one of the CSS modules. It's a word that's used in one of the CSS modules, one of the CSS specifications called the intrinsic and extrinsic sizing principle. And as we are fish learning to walk on land and we learn about water, some of the stuff we're learning about is sizing and overflow and things that have been around for a while, and this concept of intrinsic and extrinsic sizing. It's just kind of in the air. So I want to talk to you about the new reality of intrinsic web design, and really from the point of view from design, of design. There's a lot to learn around the code, but I'm more fascinated by what this means for the medium and how the medium is different, and the kinds of designs that we can do are different because of the tools that we have. So I'm going to talk about 3 things: contracting and expanding, flexibility, and about the viewport itself. So first, ways to contract and expand the space. If you think about what it means to have a viewport and to have a layout that changes so that when the viewport is smaller on phones and bigger on big screens, really what we're doing is we're figuring out how do we contract and how do we expand our design into the available space. So far, we've been doing 2 things. We've been doing wrap and reflow. So here's text being wrapped and reflowing. As it gets narrower, things wrap. They reflow as there's more space. Or with images, it's not technically worked this way, but the effect from the point of view of the user or the point of view of the design itself is that we've got the images reflowing. They've been moving around so that you have fewer of them as there's less space in the width direction and more of them as there's more space. And we've been combining those things, right? So here's cards, teaser cards, same idea, wrapping and reflowing. That's one of the things that we can do and one of the things we have been doing. Another is enlarging and shrinking. So you can make things smaller. Those images are actually getting smaller. They fit because they're getting smaller. Or you can enlarge. They get bigger when there's more space. Or on text, if you size text in viewport units, you can get viewport unit size text to get smaller when there's less space in the viewport, or bigger when there's more space in the viewport. Or about to happening now is variable fonts, where you can have a variable font that's actually narrower. Instead of being smaller in the font size dimension, it just stays the same font size, but it gets narrower, or it gets wider in order to take up space or contract into space. And a lot of what responsive web design has been is, there's the teaser cards. No, that's the combination. So it's a lot of like combining those 2 things together. So some of the things are shrinking and some of them are reflowing, and the cards are shrinking and then the cards are reflowing. So everything we know about responsive web design has really been a combination of these 2 things, shrinking and growing and reflowing in order to get smaller or get bigger. But we now have two more massive principles, two more ways that we can take up space or shrink when we need to in order to get our design to adapt and fit on the screens we have. One of them is to add or remove white space. So the item, the content might stay the same size, but you add white space around it, or you remove white space around it in order to make your layout work. And as I've said this out in the world over the last year, I get some pushback where people are saying, well, we've always had white space. We've always had the ability to make lots of white space or get rid of white space. But I think what people are thinking of from the past is the ability to add margins or add padding, maybe to make the margins be set or padding be set in percents, to change the amount of margins and padding around certain breakpoints. But it's been a very rudimentary way to handle white space, and it really hasn't given us beautiful or elegant or foolproof ways to do white space the way that we have now. Now with, starting with Flexbox being able to do vertical centering, oh my God, vertical centering. There's all kinds of ways that we can actually add and remove white space and keep a layout looking really beautiful. A lot of it comes from grid, where you can lay things out using grid. You can have a row in grid that's completely empty and sort of disappears or appears. Here's an example where I'm kind of doing that. It changes at different breakpoints, but also it's all about the white space, the empty space. Is it beautiful? Does it look good? These are the things that graphic designers were obsessed with in the early 20th century, and that has carried graphic design all the way through the last 100 years or so, more. That's what great graphic design is built on, is beautiful white space. We finally have ways to do beautiful white space on the web. The other is the ability to slide things or overlap things, where we can use grid. Because grid lets us overlap things, we can make them take up less space by sliding them one over top of another. It's one of the biggest differences between tables for layout and CSS Grid. And I've seen some blog posts written that say, oh, CSS Grid, the return of table-based layouts. You all think you're so fancy. You think you're doing something new, but we've been there, done that. And I don't like those blog posts. Because in some ways, yes, there are some aspects of having rows and columns that are common to both tables for layout and CSS Grid. But there's some very significant things that are very different. And one of them is that you can overlap things. You can have two different things kind of overlap each other. So you don't need to cut things up into tons of puzzle pieces the way that you would have in the past. You can just have the two things and they can overlap. Here's another example where here's an example in Motion where you can start to see how things change as the overlap, as there's less and more space, and I'm adjusting the amount of overlap. Here's another with a teaser card where as it gets bigger, then the headline kind of slides off the image, and as there's not enough space, the headline starts to slide into the image. There's all sorts of effects that we can take inspiration from magazines and such. Magazines use overlap all the time, and we can use overlap and sliding around as a way to take up and remove space. So ways to contract and expand the space. These are the 4 ways in which we can think about doing that as we're thinking about designs and how to use design. As mentioned before, I have a YouTube channel called Layout Land, and there are 2 videos. There's one specifically about overlap and one about white space, where I go through the code and show you who are all the front-end developers in the room. You want to see the CSS and how the CSS works. All of that code is there. 2, let's talk about new possibilities for flexibility. And specifically, let's talk about columns. We've been obsessed with columns since we first started doing float-based layouts. One thing about responsive web design that I didn't really realize until I started thinking about what intrinsic web design is that responsive web design, as it shrinks and grows things, it shrinks and grows everything at the same rate. So you've got 3 columns, and they shrink at the same rate. They grow at the same rate. If you remember, which I vaguely do, calculus and other math, right? Like, if you were to graph the rate of change, it would be a straight line, and everything would follow that same straight line. It's this way because all of the widths are being set in percents. Even the space between the columns is being set in a percent width. But with CSS Grid, we have multiple ways to define a column or to define a row. We can say, I would like this column to be fixed number of pixels or ems or rems or viewport units. You can use these values called min content or max content. You can use percent. You can use FR units, which are awesome. You can use min max. You can use auto. So because you have this assortment of options, and you can use them all in the same grid, you can use one of each at the same time in one grid, we've got a lot of possibilities. So let's talk a little bit about FR units. And in order to really explain what's going on with FR units, I need to tell you about min content sizing. Here we go down the rabbit hole. So here's a sentence, and it's in a container, and it's being wrapped because of the size of the container. So this container has some sort of explicit size. Maybe it's 200 pixels, maybe it's 50%, but whatever. The container is like, I'm this size, and the content is wrapping inside of it. But if instead we set the width to be max content on this container of text, then the box would be the amount of text, the width that it needs to be for that line of text to be all on one line and no bigger. It's kind of like, be as big as you can be, but don't be bigger than that. That's what max content means. Or min content means the opposite. It means be as small as you can be, but don't overflow. I don't want you to be smaller than your longest word when it's text. I need you to stay like nice and keep your content inside yourself, but get as small as you can get. That's what min content means. If instead you set that outer container to a percent, like 25%, well, it's going to be 25% of whatever its container is. So if it's 25% of the viewport and the viewport gets down to 100 pixels, then it's going to be 25 pixels. And it doesn't really know whether or not the word is sticking out, which is why we end up with this problem. And we end up with mugs that look like this. It's because there's no way for this box to know anything about the overflow state for its own container stuff. If instead we say, we don't use percents, we use FR units. FR units have this awesome built-in thing with them where by default, they never get smaller than the min content size. So we're going to put all of those mug company people making those mugs right out of business. And you can see that here with this example, where I've got 4 columns that are all defined as 1FR. They're all growing and shrinking at the same rate along with each other. But when it gets all the way down to the smallest size, you'll see that none of those columns get any smaller than their min content size. And the group of them then becomes this kind of fixed container, and the group will start to overflow the bigger thing. That's what FR units are going to want to do. It's kind of cool. Also, you can see those images have a width of 100% on them, so they're the width of their row, of their column. But in the vertical direction, they have a fixed height, like, I don't know, 400 pixels or something. And then I'm using Object Fit Cover to make those images get cropped. And the height doesn't go up and down the way that it normally would with responsive web design. Welcome to a new world. So here is another example where I've set 1FR, 2FR, 4FR, and 6FR. And what you'll see is the 1FR column hits its min content size first, and then the 2FR column, and then the 4FR column, and then the 6RF column. So the rate of change that's happening is not a straight line, it's a curve. I don't remember the name of that curve. I took calculus 30 years ago. But it's kind of awesome, and it's kind of weird, and it's kind of cool, and it's kind of like, what is going on around here? Where the 6x column is like growing and shrinking much faster than the other columns. This is part of the nature of what we've got now as our medium. Or here's an example. 3 of these columns are 1FR, and that other one is a min-max of 250 to 600 pixels, which means, hey, I want you to never be smaller than 250. I want you to never be bigger than 600. But there's 2 stages of squishiness. The FR columns get smaller first, while the min-max stays as big as it can be. It stays at max size. And then when the FR columns hit min content size and they can't get any smaller, then the min-max column starts to shrink down. The reason for that is because the FR units, FR means fraction of available extra space. So hey, when there's extra space, this is how I want you to divide the extra space among yourselves. But when there's no extra space, you squish down, the max content, the min-max column is not going to start to get pressure to shrink until the FR columns have stopped shrinking. So it creates this kind of 2-tiered effect. And we can design for that. We can design a situation where some things squish at a different time as other things. Here's another, to get more complicated, to make you a little more confused. We got That first column is 200 pixels. So it's just fixed. It just stays at 200 pixels the whole time. And I've got two 1FR columns, and I've got this min-max column. So you've got two stages of flexibility with the flexible columns, and then you've got a fixed column. You could not do this with float and percent-based floated responsive containers. Also, the gap can be fixed, which is really common. Maybe you want the gap to be 2m. You don't want the gap to be 3%, because there's a lot of time when 3% is too small, and there's other times when 3% is too big, and it's been driving us crazy for 8 years. Set it in m's. You know why? Because a browser's doing the math, and browsers are really good at doing math. To make it even more complicated, I tossed in an auto. In this particular situation, auto is just like, I want all the space. So the FR unit column is all squished up small. It just stays at min content the whole time because auto is a big hog. If auto had less text, or if auto didn't have an image that had width 100% on it, then auto would become its max content size. In this situation, max content for that content is huge. So it would, if we kept going way out, at some point it would hit max content and it would stop growing. These are the choices. It gets even more complicated from here, but that's enough for today. However, I just talked about columns in a horizontal TB situation. All of that column stuff is, all that column stuff, if you go to a vertical direction, just goes boop. But let's stay in a horizontal context. You can take all of those abilities, and you can apply them to rows, which is absolutely profound. There is nothing in CSS before CSS Grid that let us do what Grid Rows lets us do. It desperately changes design. So I'm going to show you this example. The columns, I've defined 1FR, min-max 0 to 40 characters. Did you know character units are a thing? Yeah, characters. To one, and another 1FR column. And the row direction, I've got 20%, 2FR, auto, and 1FR. So those two auto rows, that black box and the gray box, those are going to have text in them. So auto, when it's got text, auto height means just be the height you need to be to hold the text. Don't be bigger, don't be smaller. Just is the size that it needs to be. And then it's going to have 20% is always going to be 20% of the total height. And I've got something going on with height. I think I don't remember what, but there's some code to make the thing have a height. And then 2FR and 1FR are going to share whatever extra space is available. And this is the result. There's no media queries on this, and you get this kind of dynamic, flexible box where things grow or shrink in different ways. They're flexible in different stages in each of the dimensions. And it means, so many people are desperate for container queries, and we want to create these teaser card layouts that work in any size, context, components that will be automatically, magically resizable all the time. If we don't need a media query, then we don't need a container query, and you can start doing this today before we have some sort of solution for container queries. I talk more about min content, max content, FR units, and min-max in a 3-part series on Layout Land, where I go into a bunch of examples and show you more about what those 3 things can do. That's the new possibilities for flexibility. So even just talking about flexibility, it's so much more dynamic than it used to be. And then number 3, I want to talk a bit about how all of this changes how we can use the viewport. It gives us new options. So the viewport, of course, is this all-important container, the browser itself, the window of the browser. In the era of fluid web design, our layout, our content would pay attention to the top and both sides of the browser and the content that was in it. And the fixed width era, it would pay attention to the top edge and the left edge in a horizontal TB, left to right environment, but it would ignore the right edge. It would sort of pretend that it didn't know where the right edge was. It'd pretend like it didn't know where the bottom edge is. Responsive web design took us back to a time when when the layout, the CSS rendering engine pays attention to the left and right edges. It pays attention to the top edge, but we do not pay attention to the bottom edge, and instead we go to meetings where we try to convince designers and executives that there is no fold. We have no way to control what's going to be above or below the fold. I haven't seen a folding iPad yet, right? But with intrinsic web design, we actually can control, and we actually can react to, respond to, create a layout that has flexibility that involves that fourth edge of the screen. And it does open up a whole new world of possibilities. We can center things vertically. We can use vertical viewport units, and we can use grid rows in order to create layouts that are dynamic in both the horizontal and vertical direction. Here's an example. I sort of copied the content off the Michael Pollan website, and I laid it out in kind of how I would do it if I were doing this website today. It looks good all the time. It doesn't just sort of look weird in this random bottom edge. It's responding to the bottom edge. It's getting smaller so that it's got white space. We're controlling the white space and making it look beautiful at any time. And of course, if there was more content further down the page, you could scroll and you could see that content then. How did I do that? I did that by using CSS Grid. There are no columns. There's no need for columns. I just have one big column. But I've got several rows. So the text, both of those rows have auto-sized. They've got margins on the text. There's a little bit of space above and below that text, but those two rows are set by auto. I've got the image in a min-max statement. So once there's enough pressure on it, it will never be any taller than 350 pixels, and it will never be any smaller than 100 pixels. And then I've taken the extra space. If you go beyond the auto height of the text and you go beyond the 350 pixel max of that house, any other space that's left over, I've said, please put 3 parts at the top and put 1 part at the bottom. And the whole thing is set with a min height of 100 VH. And so if there's not enough space for the content, after the FR units have collapsed to 0, then it will start to overflow and the page will scroll. So very simple code, but it gives us a very different way to design. I've got a bunch more on viewport units and on viewports and on how to design in this kind of way on Layout Land. It does change how we can use the viewport, and I really hope that designers take up this possibility. And if you're a designer, check this out and play around with it. If you're a front-end developer and you are bored with the designs that you're getting, see if you can get in the room. I think the real trick to this is going to be finding ways to communicate, those of us who know CSS and those of us who know design, to collaborate and to work together and to create prototypes and design in the browser and figure out what it is that we can create, what this medium wants to be now that we have this medium. It does bring us to this idea of designing in the browser. There's always this question of like, should designers learn CSS, right? I have no more minutes to answer that question. But I do think that in order to really do this kind of design will be finished in the browser. So even if the designer has finished with the PDF and emailed it off into space, even if the people with the money have already said and they've locked it down and that's fixed and we've figured it out, it's done, the front-end developer is going to be finishing the design. If you're a front-end developer, you're going to be sitting there figuring out how to interpret what you've been given and actually finish the design. You might not consider yourself a designer, but that is what you're doing. And in that spirit, we have been building it at Firefox dev tools to make it easier to do this kind of work, to do this kind of CSS and exploration and designing in the browser, specifically the Firefox Grid Inspector, the Firefox Shape Path Editor, and the Firefox Font Editor. This Firefox Grid Inspector has been out for a while, but it's getting some of the bugs fixed, and it's getting more superpowers. If you're in Nightly, you can now turn on more than one grid at the same time and use it on more than one grid at the same time. It's a great way to visualize your grid. If you're trying to learn CSS Grid, you're trying to debug a layout that's been done in Grid, I found it really kind of impossible if you can't see the lines. So I was like, well, we need a way to see the lines. Like, I think I know some browser people around here. Let's see if we can, like, boom, here we go. And there's line numbers and there's area names. For shapes, you saw this earlier, there's a CSS Shape Path Editor. You can use it both on CSS Shapes, Shape Outside property. You can also use it on Clip Path to help you tweak or adjust your shape path and to make it what you want it to be in order to accomplish what you're trying to do. And this just shipped on Tuesday. The Firefox Font Editor. We've had a font panel for a long time, but we've changed the font panel into what's now called the Font Editor. And it gives you some sliders where you can drag and check things. You can adjust your font size and your line height and the amount of bold, turn off italics, a quicker way maybe than typing code. But it's especially helpful if you're using a font that has a variable axes, because then you've got a visualization of what axes are available. It will list all of the variable axes on your variable font, and it will give you you a whole bunch of sliders. It's a lot like Access Praxis or vFonts or these other websites that are popping up, but it's your website with your code. And as you make changes, all those changes are reflected in the rules panel, and you can grab them and paste them into your code. So this is Intrinsic Web Design. I really think that this fight might just be over. We might be playing, we might be able to build some really cool sandcastles. I talk more about intrinsic web design on the Big Web Show with Jeffrey Zeldman, episode 176, and also on Shop Talk Show, episode 328, to explain more of what I mean, all sorts of things. Layoutland, youtube.com Layoutland, or if you hate YouTube subscriptions and want to get updated when things come out, you can go to layout.land and subscribe by email. I also have a website called labs.jensimmons.com where I have 5 years of examples now. This is how I've learned what's possible, is by making weird, crazy examples, including all the examples from today, and they all have CodePens as well. You can click and go over to CodePen and fork it and mess around and start to figure these things out yourself. I really do think that this is an exciting time. I hope that we take up we don't just do that same unique layout over and over with 12 columns over and over, and we're just doing it faster because we have CSS Grid. I really want us to take advantage of what's new in the medium and not get stuck with the idea that things are the way they're supposed to be, because they were that way for a reason, good reasons. But as we had other ideas about how to do layout before, we're going to have other ones in the future. And this, to me, is a huge pivot in a whole new direction. Thank you.